Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 4 from the book, which is Alternatives to Experimentation, Surveys, and Interviews. So survey research is great because you can use questionnaires or interviews to get your data. Uh, a survey that I use in my research is something called the Hexaco, which measures the big five personality characteristics. And it's got great questions like, I would be quite bored by a visit to an art gallery. And then you use a Likert scale, what's called a Likert scale, which is like strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. And other questions are things like, I enjoy having lots of people around to talk with. I would strongly agree with that. And I enjoy looking at maps of different places, which I would agree with. I do enjoy that. Um, what are some of the advantages of the survey approach? I think the main thing here is that, or the main selling point of surveys is they allow you to replicate other methodological findings, or findings of other methodologies would maybe be the better way to say that. So, for example, you can do, I teach an evolutionary psychology class, and one of the things that we look at, actually, some people would criticize and say the main thing evolutionary psychology looks at is mate selection. What surveys tend to do is they replicate what we find in the laboratory. Um, so, for example, there is a sexual advantage for lighter colored eyes. Uh, 50,000 years ago, there were no blue-eyed people. Now there's a lot of blue-eyed people. And um, it's a 3% per generation advantage for lighter colored eyes, not just blue. Um, and this is cross-cultural too. And survey research bears this out. People like people with lighter eyes. Now, surveys aren't like experiments, though, because you don't manipulate any variables or independent variables. You don't control the antecedent conditions because there are none. And so surveys are not experiments. And that's why it's in a non-experimental chapter. So what are the steps in putting a survey together? Identifying specific research objectives, narrower is always better. So don't try to take on too much. The degree of imposition of units just means, are you going to go with open or closed questions? Are you going to give, like, allow people to give long open-ended responses, or are they going to have to choose between just a few alternatives, what's called structured questions? Actually, we're going to talk about that next. Uh, with closed questions, there's a limited number of responses that people can give. So an example would be, should smoking be allowed on campus? Yes or no. Those are the only alternatives people have. Or on a 1 to 10 scale, with 1 being not important and 10 being very important, how important is Beyonce? And so, you kind of leave that open for interpretation, but they can only give an answer on a 10-point scale. My answer would be an 11 or a 10. An open-ended question means that you're really not controlling what people, they can answer anything they want. And so the example they give here is, why do you choose your major? What we usually hear in psychology is because I like people, which is good. I was a history major too. So if somebody asked me, why'd you go into history? I'd say, well, I like history. So you want it to be more open-ended than that, though, so that there's a wider variety of responses. Uh, in evolutionary psychology, we would say, what qualities do you look for in a marriage partner? And so that's leaving it very open-ended. Um, the main, or the number one thing that both men and women look for in a marriage partner, personality characteristic that they look for, is kindness, which makes a lot of sense if you've ever been in a relationship. Content analysis is something, actually content analysis is what got me tenure. We do content analyses of personal ads that people place. So people who are looking for a mate, We used to do it in newspapers. Now we study it online. But we look at their personal ads and see what they talk about. They talk about their age, how much education they've had, activities that they like, their physique, and yeah, so you can analyze the content, hence content analysis of their personal ads. So what are some concerns when you put survey questions together? Number one is keep it simple and don't have double negatives. What's an example of a double negative? Well, like the Rolling Stones said, I can't get no satisfaction. Does that mean they can get satisfaction? A better example for that's relevant to a lecture like this is you could have an agree-disagree question, and the question is, you should not take an online class. Now, if you agree with that, you're saying you should not take an online class. If you disagree, you're saying you should not take an online class. So that's where it gets confusing. Number two is double-barreled or compound questions. An open version of this would be, what sports do you like? A closed compound question would be, do you like baseball and football? Well, maybe you like baseball, but you don't like football, or vice versa. But it makes it a difficult question to answer because by grouping them like that, it's, yeah, maybe you like one but not the other. Use exhaustive response choices means that closed questions should contain all possible alternatives. The way around this is just slap other onto it. The government does this a lot of times when they ask people's race. They have a list and then it says other. And so you can classify yourself as whatever you want. On my 2010 census, I put myself as other transhuman because I thought that was kind of funny. The alternative to that is just going with open-ended questions too, so that works. Next is, how do we assign numbers to attributes? And so we're going to talk about the different types of scales: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scales. These go up in complexity, and all the higher scales have the characteristics of all the lower scales, but they add something more in addition. So nominal scales are the least sophisticated types of scales. They show difference, but it's not a quantifiable difference. So, for example, your zip code, it's a number, but it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean, it's not a quantifiable number. So Kirksville is 63501. That's not less than, say, someone who lives out west, where the numbers are higher. That start in California, the zip codes start with 9. That's not more in California. Another good example would be something like genders on a nominal scale. Nominal scales show difference, but it's not a number that you can assign to it, a quantifiable difference, or political affiliation. Difference, but not quantifiable. The next scale is an ordinal scale. Anytime you rank something, then that is an ordinal scale. They show magnitude, but they don't show what the difference in the magnitude is. So things like class rank are ordinal scales. For me, in my high school rank, I was 52nd out of 534 people, which puts me in the top percent. Yahoo! You might ask people something like, what are their 3 favorite foods at Taco Bell that you want them to rank them? And for me, that's like choosing between my children, but it's still a ranking. And so that would be on an ordinal scale, because we don't know what the differences are between those numbers. But an interval scale, here it's using equal intervals, which is using the word in the definition, which is a big no-no. But Fahrenheit or centigrade temperatures, if we look at that for a second, the reason why this is an interval scale is because 0 doesn't really mean anything. So 0 degrees Fahrenheit means very cold, or 0 degrees centigrade means the freezing point of water. And so therefore, we have to go with a different scale to be a ratio scale. That's Kelvin, so where 0 means, no temperature whatsoever, no activity. Another example is the year that we live in. So this is, I'm recording this in 2015, but there is no year 0 on that scale. People in year 0 didn't know they were living in year 0. And so 0 doesn't mean anything. But years are still 365 and a quarter days long, and so they're equal intervals. And so that's why that's an interval scale. One last example here is what we call a Likert scale. And that's what we talked about earlier with strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. In psychology, we consider Likert scales to be interval scales. So there's equal intervals between strongly agree and agree. I think a strong argument could be made that Likert scales are actually ordinal, but if we consider them to be interval scales, then we can use parametric statistics on them, which are more powerful, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Ratio scales have absolute 0 points on them. Another way to keep in mind ratio scales is you can make proportional statements. As it says, a 2-meter board's twice as long as a 1-meter board. I weigh 180 pounds. That's twice as much as someone who weighs 90 pounds. I'm 50 years old, and that's twice as old as someone who's 25 years old. The kind of things that are ratio scales are things like age, your GPA, because it could be 0, degrees Kelvin, like I said earlier, your grade on a quiz, which could be a 0 too. Yeah. So how do you select which measurement scale you're going to use? In general, the higher scales like interval and ratio are better because you can get more information out of them. So they're preferred, we might say. What's an example of this? Well, let's say we were looking at something like introversion, extroversion. A nominal version of this, trying to assess that, would be asking people, are you more introverted or more extroverted? Yeah, and so they just pick, I'm more introverted or I'm more extroverted. So there's just a difference there. A interval way of measuring this would be saying, on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is introverted and 10 is extroverted, where are you? And so it gives you more data, so it's better in that sense. Why is it better? Well, because we can use more powerful statistics. We can use parametric statistics on interval and ratio data. Parametric statistics are based on a normal curve, which means that they're normally distributed, and so we can do things like ANOVA or correlation or multivariate statistics on them too. What kind of things should we take into consideration when creating survey items? Engage them from the start by asking them interesting questions. Who can argue with that? The first survey question, it gives some ideas here. You should avoid questions where the response would be something like, gee, I don't know. I teach cognitive science, and all of the tests are take-home, and they're all essay. And the kind of questions I ask are things like, is it possible to create a robot that laughs, but only at funny things? That's not easy to answer, or answerable by most respondents, and it maybe not be very interesting either. Another question I like to ask is, could you love a robot that expresses love for you? And my favorite answer to that, I had a student a few years ago who said, it depends what everybody else is doing. If everybody else is loving robots, then absolutely. But if I'm the only one, I'm not going to be the weirdo who loves the robot. What should you consider when creating survey items? Don't make value-laden statements a part of your survey. Let me give you an example of this too. In the animal rights world, they draw equivalence between laboratory animals and people. And so they say a rat is a cat is a chimp is a child. And so a survey question that is not a good survey question would be something like, is it as reprehensible to destroy a rat's brain as it is to destroy a child's brain? Because the person taking the survey would probably be like, I don't want to destroy anybody's brain. So that's not a good question. Response styles are just tendencies, the way people tend to answer questions. And so how do we circumvent these problems? Willingness to answer is the tendency to guess or skip items. If there's no right answer on your quiz, or on your survey, excuse me, then tell people that there's no right answer, because then they'll be more likely to answer, because they don't want to be wrong, but if there's no right answer, then they're fine. A good example of this is something like the MMPI, which asks a lot of yes-no questions, agree-disagree questions. And one of those items is, I'm afraid of spiders. Yes or no? What's the right answer? There is no right answer. Some people are afraid of spiders, others are not. There was a humorist who put together a funny version of the MMPI called the North Dakota Null Hypothesis Brain Inventory. It's Art Buchwald, if you want to Google that. But he asked the same kind of questions, but silly versions like, I've never been startled by a fish, or spinach makes me feel alone. No one would skip those questions. A position preference is when you always pick C on a multiple choice. A couple ways to get around this. The obvious answer is to randomize the answers. And that's what I do with my quizzes. So it's different every time. So the answer's not usually C. A version of this with, if you're studying something like introversion, extroversion, is something called a forced choice paradigm, where you ask people questions like, would you rather walk in the woods or go to a concert? And, you just choose an answer. So there's no position preference. You either like going for a walk in the woods or going to a concert. It gets at introversion, extroversion because you walk in the woods usually with one person or a few people or by yourself, whereas a concert is with thousands of people or hundreds of people, hopefully not just you and your friend. Yeah. We talk about the manifest content and the latent content and what people read into questionnaires. This really comes from Freud, who talks about the manifest and latent content of dreams, where the manifest content's the storyline of the dream, and then the latent content is what the dream really means. So what are some problems here? Yay-saying and nay-saying. Agreeing with everything, every item, which is called response acquiescence, or disagreeing with everything, called response deviation. The solution to this is to avoid a yes, no, agree, disagree format if you can, or otherwise just rework it so that, mix it up so that it's not always, yes is congruent with one answer or no is congruent with another. So phrase it differently. Context effects. Don't have previous questions prime future questions. And so, if you're asking about music or something like that, you might prime it by asking about specific artists. And you want to put some buffer questions in between to cleanse the palate, the mental palate, if you will. Social desirability. People want to, it's self-presentation. Think about how people, how their Facebook or LinkedIn profiles are different from who they are in real life. It's just how people want to be represented or represent themselves publicly and how that impacts how they answer. We can talk about structured and unstructured interviews. Structured interviews ask the same questions every time. Most job interviews should be structured interviews because it avoids bias and lawsuits. In unstructured interviews, you're just basically asking whatever you want. It's good if you're studying individual difference. differences. For example, because every marriage is different. And so an unstructured interview with a couple might be, describe your last argument. And so that can go in any direction at that point. What is a sample versus a population? Well, a population is any group that shares at least one characteristic. Now, they could share multiple characteristics. You could have a population of male American asthmatics because they all share those characteristics. A sample is a subset. Samples are much smaller than populations. So, for example, this is like polling, like Gallup polls or Roper polls during presidential elections, but they might survey 2,000 people to get at the or predict the voting of 60 million people. And so samples are much smaller than populations. What are the advantages of probability sampling? Well, random sampling tends to be high in external validity because in the long run, you approximate the population that you draw from. We'll talk about that on the next slide too. Really, you could spend an entire semester on probability sampling and non-probability sampling. But in a nutshell, simple random sampling is where everyone has the same probability of inclusion in the sample. So if you have 100 people in the room and you're going to pick 20 of them, then everybody has the same probability of being picked, which is 1 in 5. Systematic random sampling is when you just pick every nth person to be in your study. So in a class of 100 people and we need 20, we just pick every 5th person. And that's how you get your sample. So it's still probability sampling. A stratified random sample is if you have subgroups in your sample, you pick them in their proportion to the population until that's met. So again, if you might pick 100 people in proportion to things like gender, race, sexual orientation, age, etc., really whatever you want to pick based on. And then in cluster sampling, groups of people are picked instead of individuals. And so again, if you wanted to pick 20 people, you might pick 20 people on the right side of the room. And then basically pray that they're representative of your population, because that is a serious external validity issue. Non-probability sampling is the vast majority of sampling. Quota sampling would be taking people by their proportion in the population. So let me give you an example. Truman State University is 62-48 female to male population. So what this means is you talk to any 62 women, the first 62 women who come along, and the first 48 men that come along, because it reflects the makeup of the student population. Convenience sampling, sometimes called accidental sampling, is grabbing whoever's available. And so this is the way most psychological research is run. Really, it's by far the most common method of sampling. Yeah, it's the way most research is done. Big external validity issues with convenience sampling, though. Purposive sampling is when you just pick one group. So let's say if you're asking people about their college experience, you just pick seniors. And so you're sampling with a purpose. You might just pick seniors because they have the most experience in college. They're leaving soon. They're able to reflect on their experiences. Freshmen don't know as much about college. And then lastly, snowball sampling, which really is important and is useful when you're studying hard-to-reach populations. This is when you ask one person in the sample to lead you to other people in the same group. And so this would be a good example. This is something like gang members. If you're doing research on gangs, good luck getting a random sample of that. But if you can get some gang members to be in your sample, they know other people who also know other people, and you're able to create a sample from that. So that wraps up Chapter 4, and thanks for listening.